T-34 versus Panzer IV. So we're gonna do kind of like we're gonna get into the ring and we're gonna duke it out. So we have in this corner, T-34, and we have Dmitry Trofimenko, tank builder, Soviet armor genius. Even at an early age, he quickly stepped into the spotlight with his brilliant mind. Age 6, drove his first tank. Age 9, T-72 program shop foreman. Today, Dmitry works across the board on all fields of Soviet-Russian designed armor and is to be considered an expert in this area. One of the top minds of Soviet-Russian designed armor in the United States, if not the world. He is an expert in the field of the development and the history of this thing. And in this corner, we have Randy Beard, Panzerfabrik. The reason for Randy Beard's celebrity among tank builders is simple. He builds German World War II vehicles. A lot. And when he decided a replica was not good enough for him, he built the real thing. From scratch, out of the ground, fully operational Panzer IV. This made Randy somewhat of an expert in this field. He has no plans of stopping. The creator of this beautiful piece you see here, we have done a series prior on this whole deal and everything that went into it. Today it's going to be the two adversaries meeting together, but not in the sense of combat setting, more in the sense of we're going to discuss the engineering and manufacturing mindset of both Russia and Germany at the time and how essentially these tanks appeared as they are right now, and what actually went into the difference of the mind and the thought of the Germans and the Russians to produce these two adversaries of where they were at in the war. So enjoy the video.
The new Soviet Russia, its position in the world globally was basically a rising power. But it was important to understand where Soviet Russia was at the time, and most importantly in the industrial sense of that word.
At the time that the early German tanks were being developed, it was in the 1930s. So you have to consider that World War I had just left Germany completely devastated, completely all manufacturing. They were being punished basically by the Treaty of Versailles to be brought to heel. So there was the rise of the National Socialists, which is known as the Nazi Party. And in the 30s, when that came in, then there was kind of a revitalization in Germany. So the national mood was to rebuild what they had lost in World War I.
Russia went through almost a complete collapse of its social structure. I'm talking about a revolution. And pretty much whatever the remnants were of any type of industrial structure, most of that was destroyed. The reason I'm pointing to that is because when Soviet industrialization problem began, it began sort of like from a scratch. And they had to start everything all over again. On top of it, the world was changing rapidly. In 1920s and 1930s, if you look at the technologies, the way they were evolving in Europe, in the United States, the world was just going through this immense evolution very quickly. So the leadership of the Soviet Union, they felt pressured that they needed to keep up and in order to survive in that new world, that new rising world. And as history later on showed, they were right.
The concept of mobile army warfare or mobile tank warfare was a new idea. It was unthought of prior. Guderian came up with the doctrine that is still used today, basically the Blitzkrieg doctrine. It was all on paper. So in the 30s, the Germans set out to create the vehicles that they can prosecute this new type of war. But because of the Treaty of Versailles, they were forbidden to have a very large army. Everything was limited, and they were forbidden to have tanks. So all of the tanks that were being developed in the 30s were done in secrecy. They said that they were farm tractors and other industrial vehicles. So the Panzer IV was developed at a time when no one knew what a tank looked like, and they were experimenting with new ideas, and they were having to do it in secrecy.
I guess, well, I'm going to put my thought out there. This is what I was thinking for quite some time. Maybe part of like that difference between Germany and the way the Soviets did it, like sort of like in the sense, a reflection of their culture, maybe that has to do with like a nature of its society and so on. And what I mean by that is because if you look at it historically, if we look at like the world of Europe, generally speaking, right? If you look at a continent of Europe, well, you have Germany, and Germany is surrounded by its neighbors, right? So there was always that natural, throughout the ages, there was this constant competition because there's so many different nations packed into this pretty limited patch of land, if you think about it, and they always had that natural competition between each other to be better, to be more precise. The Germans were known for their optics, for their precision, and so on, just to show others because they were in that constant contact with others. Where if you look at Russian history was most of its advancements, especially in the military technology, was due to invasions throughout history. So the Russian society was more or less isolated. It was always deep in the land. So most of its progress would happen, again, most of the time when they were invaded by someone, and that's when they would learn the most about other nations. Usually when they would be forced to, okay, holy crap, we have a problem now. We need to get together. There's that unity. So we need to get together and we need to do something about it. Otherwise we will all die individually. So we need to get together and solve the problem. So, and that seems historically, that seems to be that natural drive. That's why I think Russians are usually really good at understanding a general concept of a strategy, meaning what is the big picture. Let's not so much worry about the little things, if this is right, if this is accurate, but what is the big picture? What will win the war? They pay attention to statistics, it seems to me, a lot more than, let's say, Germans would. But again, so I think a lot of that comes from nature of how countries came up, and I would say it's historical nature, I'll put it that way.
So to paraphrase, what I'm hearing is Russia more or less playing catch up through the industrialization of it.
In a way, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Playing catch up. One thing that I've noticed with working on the T-34s is there's kind of two aspects of the technology behind it. To me, I've identified, it seems to me, if a piece is important to the tank functioning and doing what it's supposed to do, then it's very precise, it's very well engineered, it's very simple, robust, all the good things.
Yeah.
If it's not important,
yes,
it's scabbed together, rough, just thrown together. Yeah. There's really no great consideration done to the things that aren't important, just to make it pretty or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think probably what you're speaking of, that's that reflection of more of a collective thinking. And in a way, I know this isn't a political conversation, but this was the reality of the time. We had the socialism and then, with the system that was in Germany. But I think in the ways, I would say in part, that system, the way it bloomed in Russia, that was kind of natural to the Russian society, once again, because of that historical experience of learning how to get together. And they had to figure out very quickly, okay, because, Russians are, it's not all perfect, it's not all the same. It's kind of just like people anywhere, there's different mindset, different ideas. So they always had to find the shortest path towards that collective unity, and that reflected in their technology in the same way. So yeah, I think.
So in contrast to playing on that, in the German culture at the time, it was still privately held businesses in commercial competition with other commercially held businesses. So there were multiple tank designs taking place by different engineering firms, by different production firms, and they're in competition with one another. So in Germany, maybe the fit and finish becomes much more important to be the finest tank and to be chosen for the contracts to produce for the Army, where under the different system, it's more maybe centrally controlled. And
Definitely
it's
makes
not
sense.
economically controlled. But in Germany at the time, these were independent contractors, and they had a product. They were developing a product to sell, and that was a driver on a lot of this.
So the precision was sort of like this was their the face of what they did, basically, the representation.
If we can make a better product, then
Yeah.
we're going to get to sell our product to the government and have it fold into the Army. If we cut corners, then we're not going to be chosen. Nobody's going to buy our product, that kind of thing.
Definitely makes sense to me, that's for sure. Yeah. So the beginnings of the T-34 started much earlier than what everyone saw at the beginning of the war. I will go as far as one of the general engineers, people that were inspired to design this machine, engineer Koshkin. He actually was inspired by one of the early British tanks. This is kind of like what got him going, got him started, because we have to understand, this is very important, that was that time in history when the world didn't know what the tank was supposed to look like. The concepts were being developed. The people were trying to understand how it was going to work, how it was supposed to work. And as I've mentioned before, the world was evolving so quickly in the field of technology. The machines that look so old and out of date for us today, back in those days, for many people, they would look like these marvels of technology. The T-34 roots began with the search of a platform by the Soviet government. When the Soviet Union was going through the process of industrialization, they understood that they're going to need to build the armor fleet. Now, what will that armor fleet look like? What will the tanks look like? All of that needed to be understood. So the Soviet engineers went on traveling the world and looking at armor manufacturers of that time, leading armor manufacturers, just search for a path, understanding how to do this. They went through Britain, I believe there were other countries involved, and eventually they ended up in the United States. And that's where we're coming back to the Christie suspension. Well, the engineer, what was his name, Christie? I guess, right? So the engineer that designed that type of suspension, when the Soviet delegation came over to take a look at what he had, it wasn't even a complete tank. It was just the hull of the tank. There was no turret. Pretty much the top was missing. But then when they saw how that machine performed and they were fascinated by that, they saw a path. They saw what they felt that was the beginnings for the armor fleet of the new Soviet Union. The early Christie suspension actually had ability to run with or without the tracks. Now, during the development of a T-34, actually two concepts of this tank early on were designed. One of them was tracks only, and another concept was you could take off the tracks and run on its wheels. So eventually the decision was made to go with a pure track design. The reasons for that were quite simple because the other concept, the one that could run without the tracks, was more complicated. Therefore, it was heavier, so it was more limited on increase of armor. Even back then, engineers already understood that whatever they built, whatever platform that they will build, will need to be upgraded and improved armor-wise. So that's why they chose the pure track design, and it was easier, simpler, and cheaper to produce as well, because Soviet Union definitely had its limitations in production. And that's where the talents of one of the main engineers, Koshkin, that's where his talents really bloomed. His main idea was to search for that nearly perfect balance between mobility and armor protection and firepower. That was the golden triangle that he always worked towards.
Okay, the roots of the Panzer IV began with a vehicle that doesn't look like a modern tank at all. It was kind of a cross between maybe some locomotive and tractor technology. And it was a really large unit, and eventually that kind of got scrapped, and they figured out a better way, and then that's where they came up with the basic design of the Panzer IV. The original Panzer IV was much thinner armored, where I think the maximum armor on it was like 20 millimeters thick, and most of it is even 12 millimeters thick. It had carried a short barrel 75 millimeter gun, and it was completed as a tank design, and then kind of utilized a little bit, but kind of set aside and wasn't used as the main tip of the spear as far as the German Panzer forces whenever World War II actually started.
So the T-34 was very much a reflection of an economical and industrial realities of the Soviet Russia at that time. Some of it was advantageous, some not. But most importantly, the type of economical structure that the young Soviet Union had at the time was very much a collective mindset. So let's figure out and make sure that this thing works. So basically none of it was profit-based. It was all about just making this machine work. And that's where a lot of the ideas of balance and so on came to be. So without a doubt, there were some personal influences of different engineers and so on, and there were rivalries between engineering bureaus at the time. But the main tasks was ahead of all of that. It was important to have a tank, and that's exactly what they did. Now, it is also, it's also important to understand that the Soviet Union was still going through it was very much in the middle of its industrial revolution. And that means that industrialization process wasn't complete. And that is why early T-34s actually did not perform all that well. They had issues with transmissions, issues with optics, even their armor, and so on. But the concept was there, and that was the key. It was these big bugs that needed to be worked out through the process of war, and pretty much that's what led to this version, this second generation of a T-34.
Okay, in contrast to what was taking place in Russia, where they were, as described, kind of building for the first time, the German economy and culture had already been there. They had been a major imperial power prior to World War I and had amassed great technology and weapons during World War I. But they were defeated. So after they got defeated, all of that slate was wiped clean. So by the time the Panzer IV comes into play and we're trying to develop that, it's more or less not building for the first time an industrial complex, but kind of recapturing and regaining the industrial complex. So a lot of the technology and the expertise, the machining capabilities, the metallurgy had already been there before. So it was more or less a gathering up of what applies to tank building and then reapplying that to go forward. With a huge spirit of nationalism at the time and kind of trying to rebuild and become somebody again. There was a great effort put into revitalizing the military and everything, although in secret. And so a lot of those features of the time, and I emphasize of the time, of the 30s, were involved, or were put into the Panzer IV in its final pre-production designs. By the end of the war, as we know, the technology had far left the Panzer IV behind, and you're into the highly complex hydrostatic drive technologies that you find in the later tanks. So Panzer IV kind of had its day in the sun, designed during this revitalization period, and then quickly in 5 years became passed by.
So the simplicity of the T-34, let me take it to the early part of its production. So when the concept of the T-34 was developed and decision was made to put this tank into production, the first thing was done is that the engineers took this tank back to the drawing board and they made, I believe, over 800 changes to it. And in that process, they got rid of, I believe, over 5,500 components. Now, that was driven mainly by the realities of the Soviet industries. Since the Soviet Union was still going through its industrialization process, many of the Soviet industries were simply not ready yet. The industrial realities is what dictated what was gonna come out of the assembling line. What I mean by that, is you can design almost a perfect machine out in, so to speak, a lab, right, in an engineering bureau. You can have the concept, but then you have to look at your industries and you have to say, like, well, what are we capable of producing in a mass production sense? And that's where a lot of the changes happened, where, you know, a lot of the mechanisms were simplified, made more robust, and some elements they simply got rid of. Once again, is what your production is capable of. And so the T-34 is very much a child of that reality.
So we get to the good parts, right? The interesting part. What happens when these two tanks face each other? Now we've got Russian tanks developed, German tanks developed. I would say that the fact that Panzer IV became a viable main iconic tank of German World War II is directly in response to the introduction of the T-34 on the battlefield. At the time, the Germans had nothing to compete with the T-34. The Panzer III was too light gunned. The Panzer II certainly. They were having to knock these out with artillery pieces and things like that. Was the only way they could kill it. So it's actually the Panzer IV owes a lot of its fame and glory to
the T-34.
To the introduction of the T-34.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Yeah, I mean, I would say that T-34, it was a combination of things. When the T-34 first went out onto the battlefield, it instantly clashed with its own, like basically everything, all of the issues that the early young Soviet Union had in its industries, they all came out in the war. Usually that's what happens in such settings. And so there were all kinds of issues. So the early T-34s were actually not quite as glorious as sometimes people make them out to be. They've had issues with their armor, with their optics. There was a definite gap between, like, let's say on the German tanks, they had much better optics and so on. There was a number of issues. There was issues with the transmissions breaking down. They were breaking their gears. I believe there was the reverse gear was one of the biggest problems. But however, despite all of those issues, that enormous bouquet of problems, the Germans saw a number of times they felt the impact, they felt the difference when they were using their anti-tank guns, and then they saw its potential in its maneuverability and ability to withstand hits and so on. There were a number of instances when T-34s took several hits, and because of the new type of armor, they actually did well. So like I said, it was not a perfect beginning by any means. It was riddled with issues, riddled with problems. A lot of it, like I said, is a reflection of the realities of the Soviet industries early on in the war. But then the concept itself, of course, I think it turned out to be just a more of a functioning concept out on the ground. So.
I know that by all accounts, the Germans were sent reeling when they hit the early T-34s, which had the smaller turret and a smaller gun and the other things that you're mentioning. But it sent them reeling when they found they ran into the sloped armor, and anything they could throw at it would ricochet and bounce off. I read at some point the account of one of the early times that a German force ran into a T-34, and it took multiple tanks and maneuvering and all of the technology they could throw at it to kill this first T-34. And they said, "Oh my God, what is this that we've run into?"
Yeah.
And so at that point, that's when Germany stepped back and said, "We have really got to figure something out to up our game, because they've got something out there that we don't want to fight as we are right now."
I can definitely see that. I mean, like I said, well, and again, coming back to what I spoke about earlier, I believe there was like just as many tanks lost early on, of the T-34s lost early on, was actually due to technical issues, mechanical issues, like the support teams, they couldn't quite catch up to the front lines and so on. But once that was ironed out, eventually at one point, most of the T-34s that would come off the assembling line, the tank crews were actually sent to the factory. That's kind of like how Soviets were dealing with those problems. The tank crews were actually sent to the factories, and they watched and even participated in building their own tank that they ended up using out on the battlefield. That turned out to be a very effective tactic and so on. But again, they've learned this was this was a way to learn written in blood, of course. They've definitely, by all means, they've learned the hard way, the painful way. Well, I guess in some way the same thing happened with the Germans too. They began to learn really quickly. Yeah. I mean, the part of that, I think possibly maybe one of the problems that the Germans encountered in what you've described, I think some of that had to do with their ideology, reflected on the ideology a little bit, meaning like being superior in every way, and then you come into the battlefield with that mindset, and then holy crap, you know. And but as far as I know, I read a few things about accounts of German soldiers and how they quickly got rid of that mindset. It was one of the best ways, and I think that's from either side, from the Soviet side or from the German side. The fastest way to get rid of that mindset, how you are just going to crush them with your will and soul because you're superior in whatever way, that blew right out of the window the moment you hit the ground.
Keep in mind that Germany had just trounced Poland. They had just taken over Poland in 2 weeks. They took over France. They ran into armor, the British armor and the French armor, and with their skill through training and advanced radio communications, which is worth mentioning, the Germans were extremely trained, and by the time they rolled into Russia and had great gains in the beginning, these were experienced soldiers. They were highly trained. They had great radio communications. They had a fighting structure that was second to none in the world, and they were steamrolling countries.
True.
And I believe that the T-34 was one of those first rude awakenings to their vulnerabilities. Is that they ran into the T-34 armor, and they said, "Oh my God, here's something that's maybe better than our stuff at the time." And so we've got to up our game, and that was the beginning of the death of the Panzer III and the reinvestment back into the Panzer IV to up gun, up armor, to go fight Soviet armor. So one of the ways that Germany dealt with the armor and the capability, the prowess of the T-34 was they had to fall back on training and past successes, tank crews that had been fighting together for a year, units that had been working together, and a super important factor is communications between tanks. All the German tanks had radio communications and they could talk to one another. And the T-34s, for the most part, I think, as I recall, maybe the command tank had a radio to talk back to base or something like that, but the common T-34, I don't believe, had radios in it, and they were using a system of signal flags to talk back and forth. So when the two armies would meet, even at the time German tanks being inferior, could outmaneuver and they were communicating amongst themselves, and they could flank the enemy and find vulnerabilities and kill it.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point. In fact, the radios has been something of an Achilles heel for the Soviet Army, especially early on. That issue was for the most part ironed out towards the end. But I believe there is even a document exists of Joseph Stalin either making a remark or mentioning to someone to use radios, because sometimes the Soviet soldiers, even when they had radios, they either wouldn't know how to use them or barely know how to use them or wouldn't use them at all. That was a sort of a chronic problem. And again, that issue, it all reflects into what I spoke about earlier, like the T-34 itself being a reflection of the industrial reality. Well, we also need to understand that most of the Soviet population, overall, the technical education of the population was much, much lower than it is of the Germans. Germans or the Americans or most of the Western countries at the time. And because the Soviets in that area, the Soviets were still playing that catch-up game. That's why the early Soviet government, one of the first things they actually invested money into was not weapons. It was actually schools, universities, and so on, education of the general public, because they were aware of that problem. And it wasn't fast enough, I guess. So when the war began, and again, the T-34s were built in such a way, as many people mentioned, and there's truth to that, to where even a peasant from village, from middle of nowhere, could just jump in and somewhat quickly learn without any technical background. That's how these things were designed. And again, yes, that's absolutely true. That was a big problem, especially early on for the Soviets. Yeah, lack of radios, because when you use radios on the battlefield, everyone knows a tank is very limited visually out on the battlefield. You can't see much out of that damn thing. Even today, in the most modern tanks, that issue still stands. Very limited visibility. But when you have, as you described, if you have a number of tanks communicating with each other, that's like building pixels of the picture. Hey, that's happening here, this is happening. And if they can actually know how to properly communicate with each other, that's gold. So yeah, I can definitely say that. That can be accredited to Germans. Their way of communicating with each other was very advanced at the time. Definitely agree with that.
The basic core Panzer IV. You got your rounds feeding out of one bag. This round is specifically built for this.
So you can already see German engineering in this thing. What?
Yeah. Unfortunately, they figured out along the way that you can't take two heavily armored pieces and bolt them together with 12mm bolts and have them hold together in an explosion.